Guy is the Deputy Director of the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford, also the Deputy Director for the Oxford Centre for Neuroethics, also a Research Fellow at Pembroke College, and soon to be University Lecturer for Practical Ethics in Oxford. So as you can see, he's a man that's got a lot of energy and dispersed widely in the Oxford community, and also writes widely on a number of different topics. In fact, he just informed me before the beginning of this session that this is sort of a sideline for him, but nonetheless, I'm sure he'll give us a very interesting talk. But just to tell you a little bit about his research, he works on methodological and substantive issues in ethics. He's written on the ethics of procreation, the ethics of enhancement, about pain. He's written about should we believe in God, or would it do us good to believe in God?
Oh, should we want God to exist? Very different question, much more interesting.
I particularly like the title of one of his papers, The Trouble with Being Sincere. But it is with great sincerity that I say I look forward to his talk, as do we all, I'm sure, on Is Ought and the Brain. Thanks, Guy.
I have a strong cold, jet lag, and a funny accent, so I hope you'll be able to follow everything I say. Okay. So Tolstoy wrote that science is meaningless because it gives no answer to our question, the only question important for us: what shall we do and how shall we live? Tolstoy, of course, exaggerates. Science is obviously not meaningless. Over the past decade and over the course of this conference, we've learned very many fascinating things about the moral brain and the psychology of ethics. This research is of immense theoretical interest. But it is true that it will only be of real interest to normative ethics if it can tell us something new about the substance of ethics, about what we ought to do and how we ought to live. These lines from Tolstoy were quoted by Max Weber in his famous 1918 lecture, Science as a Vocation, one of the seminal statements of a deep, unbridgeable divide between fact and value. After quoting Tolstoy, Weber adds that science does not give an answer to this question is indisputable. Many contemporary scientists and philosophers disagree. They think, for example, that there's a universal ethic written into our brain that we need to uncover and live by, or that neuroscience can rule out or even eliminate certain moral theories. Some even bluntly state on the covers of their books that science can determine human values. At the very far extreme, you even find a view that ethics should be entirely assimilated into science and the philosopher's armchair thrown to the flames. But even many who would not go so far still think that neuroscience and psychology can have dramatic implications for ethics. We've heard Josh Green, who thinks that neuroscience and psychology can support utilitarianism. Others, like Patricia Churchland, thinks that neuroscience undermines utilitarianism. At the other extreme, we find the view that science and ethics, to borrow a phrase from Stephen Jay Gould, are non-overlapping magisteria, that neuroscience and psychology have no normative significance. Many moral philosophers hold this view, or at least dearly hope that it's true. It's boring and banal to reply that the truth must lie somewhere in between, and the question is where exactly. So in what follows, I'll examine several ways in which empirical facts might bear in principle on normative claims. And this is by no means meant as an exhaustive list. But nevertheless, what I have to say is going to be somewhat skeptical, as you'll see. When someone offers an argument from scientific claims to ethical conclusions, we can always ask two questions. Are these scientific claims correct? And would these ethical conclusions really follow from them? I'll only be concerned with the second type of question. I want to ask whether we can validly move from psychological premises to ethical conclusions. And although I will refer to some particular examples, my aim isn't to evaluate any specific empirical claim or even any specific normative argument. My aim is rather to clarify how such arguments might work and what role the cognitive science of ethics generally and neuroscience in particular might play in such arguments. When people debate the possible normative significance of ethics, they almost invariably assume that the primary obstacles here are Hume's dictum that we can infer an ought from an is, and G. Moore's misleadingly named naturalistic fallacy. Moral philosophers who want protection from science often find comfort in Hume and Moore. Scientists who want to draw dramatic ethical conclusions tend to feel that they first must launch an assault on Hume and Moore, often with endearingly clumsy results. But this isn't actually a very helpful starting point. It obscures what is really at issue, and not only because what Hume and Moore said is often misunderstood. Still, very briefly and schematically, as you'll know, Hume argued that we can't infer an ought from an is, a normative statement from purely descriptive ones. G. Moore argued that good is a simple unanalyzable property, not identical or reducible to any natural or, for that matter, supernatural. It's easy to misunderstand what follows from these claims. Consider, for example, Emerson's proto-Nietzschean view that the only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it, or the common view that we ought to do what's natural. Many people assume that these claims are conclusively refuted by Hume and Moore. But that's not correct. These are substantive claims about what's right and wrong. They needn't be inferred from any other claim, nor must they assert anything about what wrong or ought mean or refer to. Of course, once you accept such a normative principle, you can infer various ethical conclusions from empirical facts about what's natural. But neither Hume nor Moore have any problem with that kind of inference. The real problem with this kind of view has nothing to do with Hume or Moore. The real problem is that it's a pretty silly normative view, a view that doesn't survive serious reflection, and when it is taken literally, has absurd implications. The view that we should follow nature at least seems attractive to some people. But considered in themselves, unadorned facts about our brain don't even have a prima facie normative significance. So the idea that we could just derive ethical conclusions from neural premises alone is hopeless regardless of our view about Hume's law or the naturalistic fallacy. We will anyway need to add some extra premises. But we need to add some extra premises isn't a problem, as some people assume. The real question is whether we can identify premises that will take us from empirical claims to interesting moral conclusions without presupposing the result or begging the question. So what premises do we need to add? This depends on our answer to another question. In most domains, we take our psychology to be a guide only to how we think about things, not to how things actually are. We don't think that our psychology is a good guide to the age of the universe or the weather or mathematics. Why then should our psychology be any kind of guide to what we ought to do? This is the question we need to start with. We need to establish some relation between our psychology and the domain we want to use our psychology to find out about. In our case, some relation between our psychology and what we ought to do. We could call this the relation problem. Such a relation would hold in the most direct way if what we ought to do was ultimately identical or reducible to facts about our psychology, or was at least grounded in such facts. So the first type of argument I want to examine simply assumes such an anti-realist view of morality. The kind of anti-realism that is most relevant here are subjectivist, or response-dependent views of ethics that ground moral facts in subjective attitudes, such as our desires and emotions. These anti-realist views do need to deny or at least get around Moore's argument, but the exact metaethical details of how they might do so are actually not very important for our purposes here. Once we adopt such an anti-realist view, we can, in principle, infer normative conclusions from psychological facts. We do need an extra metaethical premise, but as I said, this doesn't make such arguments any less interesting. What is unclear, however, is whether the cognitive science of ethics has any interesting role to play here. Now, it's true that subjectivists tie what we ought to do to psychological facts, to what, for example, we most deeply desire. But desires are dispositional states manifested in complex patterns of behavior across a range of situations, both actual and counterfactual. It's very unlikely that understanding the deep structure of our moral psychology, let alone the underlying neurobiology, is the best way to find out what people really want. If you want to find out what somebody really wants, you should begin by looking at what they say or do. There's an even greater problem, though. Current cognitive science studies our actual moral psychology. Only the crudest and least plausible forms of anti-realism ground what we ought to do in what we actually happen to desire or approve of or disapprove of. Many anti-realists ground what we ought to do in what we would desire or disapprove of in some ideal state, when, for example, we have full information, are fully rational and impartial, and so forth. And it's only from these ideal psychological facts that we can infer on these views what we ought to do. Now, it's still an empirical question of a kind, what we would desire in these ideal conditions. A question that psychology can, in principle, try to answer. But it's very different from the questions psychologists actually try to answer, and it's rather unclear how to even go about answering this question. I won't say any more about the anti-realist argument because I myself reject its metaethical premise. I find this kind of subjectivist view highly implausible. So I want to turn now to another way in which what we ought to do might be constrained by facts about us, a way that doesn't presuppose any controversial metaethical thesis. I have in mind the principle that ought implies can. Something like this is widely accepted within ethics, even taken by some to be conceptual truth. Kant was one of the first to make this principle explicit, but Kant took it literally. He argued from the fact that we ought to do certain things, even that we ought to do anything at all, that we can infer facts about what we can do, and thus draw radical conclusions about the structure of our psychology. This is a way of inferring not an ought from an is, but an is from an ought. In contemporary ethics, the inference goes in the opposite direction. From the fact that we can do something, we can infer that it's not true that we ought to do it. If you unable to cure cancer right now, you can't have an moral obligation to cure cancer right now. This form of argument also allows us to infer normative conclusions from empirical claims. But these conclusions are purely negative. They can't tell us what our obligations are, only what obligations we don't have. The principle that ought implies can perhaps demarcate the space of possible human moralities. But it still leaves open a vast space of possible things we might ought to do, whether to push the fat man in footbridge or not, and so forth. So this principle is only useful if we have some other positive way of finding out what we should do. Still, some philosophers think that this principle can do a lot of work. James Griffin, for example, believes that moral norms must be tailored to fit the human moral torso. There are no moral norms outside the boundary set by our capacities. And Owen Flanagan argues that when we construct a moral theory, we must make sure that the character, decision processing, and behavior prescribed are possible for creatures like us. These philosophers actually believe that utilitarianism is one of the ethical views that isn't fully compatible with our psychology. Now, this claim wouldn't make any sense if we took the principle that ought implies can to only apply to what we can physically do, to what causal effects we can bring about in the world. That we are not omnipotent is, of course, not a threat to utilitarianism. And in any event, if we wanted to find out what causal impact we can make on the world, our moral psychology won't be the best place to start. So the idea must be that we need to apply the principle that ought implies can, not only to what we can physically do, but also to our psychology, to what, for example, we can believe or be motivated by. And the question now is what cognitive science can tell us about that. This depends in part on what we mean by can. If we understand it too loosely, then there's no propositional content that we understand that we simply couldn't believe or be motivated by. And we certainly understand the utilitarian principle. On the other hand, if we understand Kant too strongly, then if psychological determinism is true, then it follows that we can never believe or do anything other than we actually do, and thus that we can never do wrong. So it's rather unclear how exactly we're supposed to understand the relevant psychological limits. Whatever our solution to this problem, it again seems that looking at our deep moral psychology or neurobiology aren't the best ways to find out if people are able to follow some ethical theory. For example, even if we're all born with a intricate set of deontological intuitions, this would hardly show that we can simply learn to ignore them. If you want to find out whether people can follow some ethical theory, a more sensible approach is to try to get them to follow it. Now, some people doubt that even Peter Singer really lives the life of someone who believes in act utilitarianism without qualification. But this hardly shows that this is impossible for creatures like us. After all, we often underestimate what it's possible for humans to do. So again, we face the problem that current cognitive science studies the way we actually are, where it's rather facts about what we might be or could be that might set a limit to ethical theory. Again, facts about what we could be are a kind of empirical fact, but again, it's unclear how psychology should go about establishing such facts about our limits. And again, it's doubtful that the current cognitive science of ethics will be of great help here. To complicate things further, one thing we have learned over the past decade is that our moral psychology isn't fixed or immutable. Our moral dispositions can be significantly changed by taking a single pill, as we've seen earlier. This, by the way, is just an example from a recent study we've published on the pharmacological modulation of implicit racial bias. And once this point is also taken into account, it's even less obvious that we can be confident about our psychological limits. So these were two arguments that tried to take us from psychological premises to conclusions about what we ought or not ought to do. I now want to consider two other arguments that I think are more promising. These arguments have the advantage that they don't require us to infer an ought from an is, and thus to assume some deep metaphysical relation between the two. Instead, these arguments take us from psychological premises to conclusions about what we ought to believe that we ought to do. These are epistemic arguments about moral justification, not about moral truth. And it's not at all mysterious how facts about our psychology could be relevant to the justification of our moral beliefs, even if these beliefs were about facts that are utterly mind-independent. To illustrate these two types of arguments, let's consider the well-known attempt by Josh Green and Peter Singer to use cognitive science to undermine the ontological ethics. Just to remind you, I'm not concerned here with whether Green's empirical claims are correct, although I have some doubts about them, or even with the specifics of his normative arguments. What I want to do is to clarify how such arguments might best work. As you know, Green draws on studies where people confront dilemmas, such as the famous footbridge. And we know that most people respond in ontological ways to these dilemmas. They think, for example, that it's wrong to push the fat man to say 5. In earlier work, Green's normative argument against these deontological intuitions appealed to several empirical claims. He claimed that these intuitions respond to whether some harm is up close and personal, that they are based on an immediate emotional response, and that this response is probably innate, selected by evolution. These empirical claims actually offer answers to two distinct questions, and are related to two distinct types of arguments that are often, unfortunately, conflated. The first type of argument relates to the causal origins of our intuitions, and the second one to what factors our intuitions are responsive to. Let's start with the causal origins of our intuitions and moral beliefs. we're now beginning to actually learn quite a great deal about where our moral beliefs are coming from. But the question is still whether this causal knowledge has any real ethical significance. Anthony Appiah suggests that the fact that our emotions guide our intuition about footbridge is the right sort of thing we might want to consider in deciding whether that intuition is right. This can sound like the genetic fallacy. It would normally be a fallacy to infer from the causal history of some belief of ours the truth or falsity of the proposition that we believe. But facts about the causal history of our beliefs can certainly affect our justification. This is actually a central focus of contemporary epistemology. So consider this epistemic argument. It takes us from an empirical claim about the causal origin of some belief of ours, emotion in this case, coupled with an epistemic premise that this causal source is unreliable, to the conclusion that we should be suspicious of beliefs that originate from that causal source. Now, this is only a sketch of an argument, but I think it's basically valid. This doesn't mean that it's sound, of course. I have some serious doubts about its empirical premise about emotion. But more importantly, many have pointed out that its epistemic premise is dubious. Whoever said that emotions are such a bad thing? Why think that it's an unreliable guide to what we ought to do? You might think that there's a deeper problem here. To assess the reliability of emotion or any other process that shapes our moral beliefs, we need some normative standard. But to have some normative standard, we already need to assume many substantive moral claims. So you might think that such debunking arguments are really circular, and the empirical evidence they appeal to is redundant. This might have been a problem if we were trying to answer some general skeptical worry about our moral beliefs. But if we set aside such general skeptical worries, this objection actually has very little force. Here are just two examples of how it might be answered. First, even if we do need to assume some substantive moral claims, this isn't a problem if these are just uncontroversial truisms. If we knew what processes underlie our beliefs in, say, the wrongness of torturing infants for fun, or for that matter, what makes some people think that this isn't wrong, then in principle, we might be able to use this to assess the reliability of the processes that generate more controversial moral beliefs. In a way, the focus of current research on difficult and controversial moral dilemmas gets this exactly backwards. Second, we often don't need to assume any substantive claim to conclude that certain ways of forming beliefs are utterly unreliable. If someone informs their moral views by throwing a dice, then you don't need to make any substantive assumption to conclude that their beliefs are epistemically unjustified. Put schematically, if we can identify certain causal processes that are random or that don't track the truth of some domain, then we could use empirical evidence to defeat the justification of the intuitions and beliefs that these processes produce. And I want again to ask what role cognitive science could play in this kind of argument. I've criticized the idea that we can debunk a moral belief simply by tracing its origins to emotion. But there's a deeper problem with this kind of argument. Much of the contemporary cognitive science of ethics is focused on the immediate proximal causes of our moral beliefs. But it's doubtful that these immediate causes play a central role in determining the reliability of our beliefs and intuitions. Let me explain why. We are trying to assess the causal source of our pattern of intuitions. Even if emotion was the immediate cause of this pattern of intuitions, this just pushes back the question. We now need to know why we are disposed to respond with this particular pattern of emotion. We need to know where this disposition comes from. It might be, as Green and others speculate, the product of natural selection. But it might also be due to our past experience or to something we were taught and so forth. The epistemic status of our intuitions will usually depend on the reliability of these distal sources, not on whether their immediate cause is emotional or not. One obvious distal cause of our moral beliefs is culture. I won't say much about this form of debunking argument. The idea that the cultural genealogy of our moral beliefs could be used to debunk them is of course familiar from Nietzsche and Marx. But this kind of debunking argument focuses on history and sociology. It's doubtful that the cognitive science of ethics will have a huge role to play here. Recent cognitive science has had more to say about the possible evolutionary sources of our moral beliefs. Evolutionary debunking arguments take the following form. They start from an empirical premise about the supposed evolutionary origins of some moral belief, coupled with the non-obvious epistemic claim that evolution doesn't track the moral truth. They allow us to conclude that this belief is unjustified. Notice that this argument says nothing about emotion or dual processing or any other proximal cause. If it works, it would work just as well if our intuitions were due to an intricate moral grammar without even a touch of emotion. Actually, if this argument works, we get an ironic result. The natural, far from being a guide to what we ought to do, turns out to be exactly the opposite. If some moral belief of ours is part of our nature, this would mean that it's precisely a reason to be suspicious of it. This kind of evolutionary debunking argument is pretty controversial. Here I only have time to make 3 relevant points. First, I think that evolutionary debunking arguments only make complete sense if we assume a strongly realist, mind-independent understanding of morality. If anti-realism is correct, then there is any way, no independent moral truth, that evolutionary processes might fail to track. And this means that the force of this kind of argument may ultimately depend on our metaethical views. Second, if such arguments work, they are likely to support not utilitarianism or any other ethical theory, but rational egoism. If evolutionary debunking arguments against particular ethical theories have any force, then given the evolutionary basis of our basic moral capacities and dispositions, parallel arguments against morality as a whole are likely to have even greater force. But it's unlikely that evolutionary debunking argument would stop even here. If it works at all, it's likely to undermine the justification of all of our normative beliefs, including beliefs about self-interest, leaving us with a general skepticism about what we ought to do. So I think we should hope that this kind of evolutionary debunking argument doesn't work at all. The last argument I want to consider is, to my mind, the most promising and perhaps disturbing. This argument is based not on the causal origins of our beliefs and intuitions, but on what they are responsive to. Consider, for example, this strand of Green's argument. If our intuitions about trolley cases are responsive to whether some harm is up close and personal, and this isn't a morally relevant factor, then it seems that we have a good reason to dismiss these intuitions. This again seems like a valid argument. There are, of course, serious questions about the claim that our intuitions are responding to personal harm, something that Green himself no longer exactly holds, and I'll get back to this in a moment. But I want to first look at the structure of this argument. The first thing to notice is this argument makes no reference at all to what processes generate our intuitions. If it would work just as well if it was emotion or some called universal moral grammar. Though, of course, there is some connection between the reliability of processes and what these processes track. For example, if what generated our intuitions really is utterly unreliable, then of course we should expect them to be tracking largely morally irrelevant factors. The second point to notice is that the claim that personal harm isn't a morally relevant property isn't an empirical claim. Not only is it made from the armchair, it's actually based on intuition. This, by the way, is perfectly fine. Appealing to intuition is a problem only to those who are on some general crusade against moral intuitions. But the reliance on the armchair or on intuition isn't the most interesting thing about this kind of argument. Once this argument is made explicit, it's clear to see that its structure exactly mirrors that of standard ethical theorizing. After all, when we reflect in the armchair, we also start with a pattern of intuitions and try to find out what property they track. We then ask whether that property is morally relevant. If it is, then we take that to support the corresponding moral principle. If it's not, then we discard both the intuitions and the principle. The most interesting thing about Green's argument and similar arguments isn't that they need the armchair to decide whether some factor is morally relevant. The interesting thing is actually the previous stage, the one that actually does take place in the lab, the claim about what our intuitions track. Notice that we could, in principle, have reached the same conclusion in the standard way from the armchair, simply by reflecting on our intuitions about cases. But here this conclusion is based on psychological evidence. In other words, the argument for morally irrelevant factors assumes that there's a stage of ethical reflection that is in one sense concerned with an empirical question, with what our intuitions track. It also assumes that, unsurprisingly, scientific methods might be better at answering this empirical question compared to armchair methods. These are controversial claims that I defend elsewhere, and I can say more about them here. But if they are true, this would have radical implications, or could have radical implications for the way we do ethics. It doesn't follow that we need to bear an Ernie armchair. But the philosopher's armchair will have to be pushed farther to the corner. What I'm suggesting is that psychology can contribute in a fairly direct way to a key stage in ethical theorizing. But this contribution needn't be negative or critical, as many assume. This is often overlooked because people focus on cases where intuitions seem to be tracking morally relevant factors. But as we just saw, this is a further step that takes place in the philosopher's armchair. Science leaves it entirely open whether the properties that underlie our intuitions are morally relevant or not. It might be useful to illustrate this point using an example that again comes from Green. In more recent work, Green and his colleagues report that our intuitions track not personal harm, but whether the act was intended and something they call personal force. Now, personal force does still sound like a morally relevant property. And Green et al. Indeed end their paper with the following question. Will defenders of the intending foreseeing distinction, or doctrine of double effect, bless its shotgun marriage to a normatively ugly bride, the doctrine of personal force? Well, the answer is very easy. No, deontologists will ask for a divorce. Many do find intention to be morally relevant, or at least it's not clearly morally irrelevant. So this experiment actually offers empirical evidence in support of a familiar deontological distinction. Actually, this empirical evidence could in principle lead us to revise our intuitions in a more deontological direction. It's easy to miss this because of Green's largely skeptical and slash utilitarian agenda. For our purposes, the important point is simply that this is an illustration of our psychological experiment could offer positive evidence for a general moral principle. We can set this form of positive argument more explicitly in this way. Again, I can't go into the details, but the important point here is that we can apply this approach not just to the trolley problem, but in principle to any other controversial domain of ethics where we are debating what our intuitions track. Notice that this isn't an argument from is to ought. If you want, it's an argument from psychological evidence about our beliefs about many particular oughts to reasons for endorsing a general ought or moral principle. Most current work in so-called experimental ethics has a negative aim and is driven by a naturalist, even skeptical agenda. It aims to cast doubt on the reliability of our intuitions. By contrast, the argument I've just outlined is positive in aim and is compatible even with the strongest forms of moral realism. Moreover, it actually begins by assuming that our moral intuitions are reliable. Now, although my argument sketches a way of using cognitive science to draw significant normative conclusions, flashy neuroimaging and other exciting neuroscientific techniques will actually play a very limited role here. If you want to find out what our intuitions track, you should start by finding out how people's intuition vary as we vary particular cases. In other words, you should focus on experiments that use old-fashioned and boring pen and paper methods. The kind of experiments that, in principle, William James and Wilhelm Wundt could have done. Just to conclude, I've argued that there are ways to validly draw normative conclusions from empirical premises, and more than one. And the most interesting arguments of this form are actually epistemic, arguments that don't directly infer an out from an is. I've also argued that findings about the internal structure of moral psychology or the underlying neurobiology will probably have only a limited role to play in such arguments. These arguments draw most heavily on old-fashioned, low-tech, and unexciting methods. There's a more general lesson here. It's a mistake to think that we should just let the cognitive science of ethics pursue its independent theoretical aims and then come in the end and ask what ethical implications might follow. Scientists are trying to uncover the subpersonal causal mechanisms that underlie our moral capacities. As I said in the beginning, this kind of research is of immense theoretical interest. But it might be of only limited ethical interest. The kind of psychological evidence that is probably of greatest ethical interest is actually fairly superficial from a scientific point of view, or even relate to questions that cognitive scientists don't actually ask. For example, questions about our psychological limits or ideal psychology. So cognitive science can, in principle, inform normative ethics. But if we want to use cognitive science to inform normative ethics, we might need to do our research differently or even do different research. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Guy. Is this on? Is that on? Yeah. So questions from the floor? Maybe if you have questions, if you could come up to the microphone. Okay. And then Francis, could you come up here to the microphone?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. About the last form of arguments you have used, there is a fundamental difference about the two normative assumptions about the relevance of the psychological mechanisms that are tracked. In the negative version, everybody in the philosophical community, or almost everybody, agrees that personal force is irrelevant, whereas intention is controversial. There are moral theorists that think that the DDE is valid, and there are other theorists that think that the DDE is invalid. So the second form, or the second instance of that argument doesn't work because you cannot grant the normative premise that the DDE is valid, or that the DDE is that intention is relevant. So what matters is that you have, but I think that you will, if you want to speak, will speak better than me about that, that there is a difference between non-controversial and controversial normative assumptions in that kind of arguments, or better, in the degree or on the extent to which normative assumptions are shared in the community. And this is a totally armchair and sociological fact too. So we can use that kind of reasoning just, in my opinion, just in cases in which we have a sufficient level of agreement on which moral factors are relevant or irrelevant. That's my point.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I basically agree. So the empirical stuff can tell you what your intuitions track, and then it's an open question what armchair reflection on that factors will lead to. And of course, we're again talking about intuition in which, again, there might be diversity. But I mean, the first thing to point out is that I wasn't trying to say that we have an argument in favor of the doctrine of double effect. I sketch out how an argument that is positive would work. Now, when you uncover some factor, whether it's controversially irrelevant or controversially relevant, is an open question that is entirely settled in the armchair. Some things that are morally relevant are entirely uncontroversial. Some people claim to be morally irrelevant can be very controversial. So that's an entirely open question. Second point is, of course, this is just an early stage of ethical theorizing. Ethical theorizing is holistic. There are lots of other factors that will come in. So this is one reason, based on intuition, to support a certain moral principle or factor. There will be lots of other reasons. The factor may not be itself plausible. Maybe we just don't know it. We think that our intuition are tracking something, we get some factor. We can't say that it's clearly implausible, but we can say it's clearly plausible. Think about the DDE. Nobody from a priori reasoning would support the DDE. It's based on reflection on particular intuition. So it gets much of its support from these intuitions. But when you reflect on it, it doesn't seem to many people as obviously irrelevant or obviously implausible. But then again, there'll be lots of other factors that come from your wide reflective equilibrium. There'll be other moral principles it needs to cohere to. There might be consideration of simplicity, etc., etc. And that might cause you to reject that prima facie reason or pro tanto reason that supports that principle. Now, ultimately, you may reject it or revise it and so forth. The point is just that any kind of argument that you now make from the armchair in support of some principle could also be made or made in the same way using support from psychological evidence. That's the point I was trying to make. I don't think anything you said is incompatible with that.
Hi. Should I start or wait?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. So one of the things that you said is something I was trying to get at yesterday when I was talking to Josh, namely that you do these studies and you vary cases and you find that it isn't actually the push, let's say, by itself, but something else that will distinguish pushing the lazy Susan from pushing someone over the footbridge. And Josh said, well, side effect versus intention. And of course, this is just what philosophers, old strewn territory. But the thing that worries me, I still have several worries. One is that, for example, when the psychologists construct the cases that people are supposed to respond to, it seems to me that either they ought to pay attention more to what cases philosophers have, or perhaps those with some ability to generate hypothetical cases, which is not necessarily the expertise that one is trained in to be a psychologist, right, have constructed. So, when people say, I'm responding to intention, so you might construct a case like what I call the bad man trolley case, where you have someone who sees the 5 there, turns the trolley away, hits the 1 as a side effect, but they intended to hit the 1. The only reason they bothered to save the 5 is because they see that the 1 person is their enemy, and otherwise they would have gone home and left the 5 to die. So they did turn the trolley intending to kill the 1, and many people, including myself, don't think that makes the act of turning the trolley from the 5 when it kills the 1 as a side effect impermissible. So the point is that you have to present people with these cases because, again, it's not clear that people, either those who are responding or the psychologists or many philosophers, will get it right about what it is that is going on in these cases without constructing multiple variants. And I'm not sure that, the talent for doing this lies only with one segment, of a profession. But the other question, the deeper question that worries me is this business about thinking that what you're doing, some people have said, look, they see the philosophers are testing this on their own intuitions in the armchair. And you were saying, well, maybe philosophers' armchair should go to the side and we should rely more on psychological discussions or experiments over proper range of cases, which is my first point, to see what we're responding to. But the thing is that this survey method, right, is not what philosophers are trying to get at, right? The fact that lots of other people don't respond to a certain factor is no indication that when from the armchair you find that you're responding to a certain factor, that your judgment about that factor being important is wrong just because lots of other people don't respond to it. A judgment by way of intuition is not just a limited set of data. It's the basis for an argument about the relevance or irrelevance of certain properties. So to think that you increase the validity of an intuition set by taking a big survey, right, is to misunderstand. I mean, this initial intuition, I mean, Mark Hauser asked me, why do you have such a limited data set? This is not a data set. That's not what it's intended to be. I mean, so my response to him was, suppose, you look at all your data that you've collected. I apologize for going on, but as I recall, you went on yesterday with Walter, so I'm following in your steps. If it's the case that you look at all the data that your studies have given in, Mark, right? Do you then send out all the data you've collected to all the psychologists in the world or everybody else and ask them for their responses to the data, okay? Rather, you sit there and judge what the data indicates, right? Why do you have such a limited data set, right? That's not what's going on. I mean, you don't confirm or your theory about what the data show just by doing another survey, because this leads to an endless set of surveys. That's not the function of this. And it seemed to me that to some degree you were giving in on that point, that what we're doing here is surveys, and that's what we ought to be doing, okay? We just do it with a limited data set. I don't think that's the correct way to look at this.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize.
That was quite a lot. And I'm a jet-lagged brain, so I don't know about the model brain. I think I agree with much of what you say, and I actually say it in the paper I mentioned, the armchair and the trolley. So I'll maybe start with the stuff that I remember that you said, and that I think I agree with. And now the jet lag is starting to affect me.
Constructing multiple cases.
Yes, okay, yes. Exactly. So that was one of the things I meant when I said that we might need to do research differently. So that comes in several levels. One is simply the fact that if you start with the assumption that our intuitions are reliable, that they're onto something, you generate different kinds of hypotheses, and you don't give up so quickly. I think scientists or psychologists tend to give up very quickly. They vary two cases, find something that seems to be going on, it's personal contact, and that's it, and that's the end. I think a whole recent and longer history of philosophical reflection shows that that's stopping just too early. And as you said, and as I say in that paper, philosophers might be better equipped to generate hypotheses that we need to be testing. So on that point, I certainly agree with you. The second point, I think you said quite a few things. One thing is a kind of version of the expertise defense that some people have made, that philosophers' intuitions are not identical. Maybe that's not exactly what you meant, but maybe I'll say something about that anyway. So my argument works. This positive argument works whenever you start with the assumption that some set of intuitions is reliable or onto something. And if your belief is that set is quite narrow, it only applies to the intuition of philosophers, then you'll be maybe using psychological methods to look at philosophers and ignore the folk and not doing surveys on them. So whatever your starting point of what counts as the domain where intuitions are reliable, that's the point where you'll be applying empirical methods. And if the folk are irrelevant, we can ignore the folk. It's just going to be very difficult to study using psychological methods the intuitions of philosophers, so that would be in some way unfortunate. Another point on that is, of course, you can accept the claim, which is hard to establish. I myself am inclined to accept it, that philosophers' intuitions are quite different in quality and content than many folk intuitions. That doesn't follow that surveys of folk intuition have no epistemic force. They might have much weaker epistemic force. It doesn't mean they don't tell us anything. I didn't get to the big point. Anyway, maybe I'll say something that won't satisfy you. I do say more about this in the paper. So the question is, I agree with you completely that philosophers, and that's something I emphasize in that longer paper, they are not trying to explain some data. They're not giving any kind of causal explanation. They're interested in substantive normative question. That's what they're after. I'm just saying that at one stage of what they're doing, what they're in some sense trying to nevertheless achieve is find out something about their intuitions, something they can't introspect, which is in a sense a kind of a very special empirical claim. Now, whether we can do that, answer that empirical claim better in the armchair is in a way an open question. There may be many cases where armchair methods are much better at this than the psychological ones. You might also need some mixture of evidence from both. I didn't mean to imply that it's obvious that that psychological method will always be superior, just that they are relevant. I mean, the final thing here is just to say, well, I could agree with everything you said, but it remains the case that in many domains and debates, in a trolley case, after 40 years, how long, we still haven't arrived on any agreed consensus between philosophers about what our intuitions are responding to. So it would be quite proud, I would say, to say that this possibility of further evidence that might tip the balance in one direction or another, maybe very strongly, maybe it will only add some little bit of reason to support one view rather than another. I don't think that as moral philosophers we can reject this promise. So I think it's something that philosophers should welcome in one sense. Anyway, there's more to be said, of course, but I'm sure I haven't satisfied you. Anyway. Josh.
First, thanks for a very clear and reasonable and engaging talk. I think that we're actually in pretty close agreement about the kind of research that is most directly relevant to normative ethical questions and the way in which it's relevant. The couple of comments I wanted to make are about the relationship between the kind of argument that we all agree on is good or can be good, and the kinds of other arguments that I think you are more inclined to dismiss. So I think you and I both agree that if we do research showing that some factor is having an effect, and we, not based on scientific evidence, but based on our own reactions, look at that and say, pushing with your hands, hitting with a switch, why does that matter? That can have a normative influence on our thinking. So then the question is, well, what does this have to do with emotion? What does this have to do with the dual process theory? What does this have to do with evolution? And I think that what philosophers are inclined to say is that if there's no logical relationship between these things, then there's no relationship worth considering. That is, if whether or not something is an emotional response or caused by what I've labeled an automatic setting, if an automatic setting or an emotional response can lead us to be sensitive to a good factor or can lead us to be sensitive to a bad factor, then there's no logical implication and it's irrelevant. I think it's useful to think about what emotions are in general, what automatic processes are in general, and how there might be a contingent psychological relationship between certain kinds of psychological processes and sensitivity to factors that we may be inclined to think of as morally irrelevant. And the argument is that no matter how good an automatic setting is, an automatic emotional response being one special case, it's going to have certain kinds of cognitive limitations. No matter how well informed it is, so to speak, by genes or by culture or by one's personal experience, and I emphasize that it's not just genes that's relevant here, automatic settings are inherently limited by their nature as automatic processes. And as I said in my talk yesterday, it would be a cognitive miracle if they could handle any kind of problem to which we might be inclined to put them. And so then the question is, well, they're good for a lot of things, but they might not be good for everything. Is this like, are the problems that we face when we disagree or when we're dealing with problems that are created by modern technology, as is often the case in bioethics, are those things more like reading a facial expression, automatic, and we're likely to be good, or is it more like learning to drive a car? And the idea is that when we disagree or that when we're dealing with peculiarly modern problems, the fact that it's emotional, the fact that it's automatic is, I think, in and of itself a reason to be suspicious. Not to assume that it's wrong, but to be suspicious. One comment about neuroscience in particular. I do agree that people can overestimate the moral importance of neuroscience, but I also think that neuroscientific data can potentially lead us to new insights. And so I gave a hint of what I hope might be an example about this. So I talked yesterday about how it seems that the valuation system for for some of these moral decisions is in fact, as Jim Woodward emphasized as well, the very same basic mammalian system that in modified form we've inherited from our ancestors, primates, and going all the way back to non-primates. And it could be that, among other things, our insensitivity to quantity, the fact that 1,000 lives, 10,000 lives, it all kind of feels the same to us, can be traced back to the limitations of a system that was originally designed for things like foraging for food, rather than thinking about lives to be saved. Now, that hypothesis may be right or it may be wrong, but the neuroscientific data can lead us to that kind of a hypothesis and provide support for the kind of hypothesis that we might not get from pencil and paper experiments, which I am perfectly fond of and which I've spent a lot of the last 10 years doing. I will resist the temptation to respond to Francis's comments. I almost felt like I should have stood to block Guy while she was talking. But I will say, I want to distinguish between two different approaches of empirical psychology. One is, let's do the survey approach. And I think this was, in some sense, Mark Hauser's approach, and John Mikhail still carries on this tradition of, let's figure out what the moral grammar is. Let's figure out what's really in there, and that's, in some sense, prima facie right. I'm not at all sympathetic to that. The other approach is to look at to look and find out what we're sensitive to, and look for small differences that might be affecting our judgments without attempting to explain everything. So I agree that philosophical expertise and acumen is highly valuable, and that philosophers and psychologists should be collaborating on these things. And the message is not, burn the armchair, and if the philosopher's still in it, that's okay too. The point is, I think we need both the kind of expertise that we get, the lessons you can only really get from doing experiments with between subjects designs in particular, but also I think that we have a lot of lessons to learn from the imagination and care that philosophers have taken in thinking about these cases and a lot of other problems. So sorry for the long question, and I'll just go sit.
Thanks for your statement. I've been told that I can only make a very short statement in reply. Maybe one thing to say is, that came out, I think, in one of the earlier questions. When we have these intuitions about things being morally relevant or not, I think an interesting thing is that nobody's actually studied them empirically. And there's a distinct category of intuition that is both different from intuition about particular cases on which we don't have introspective access to what we're responding to usually, but also what I think you mentioned yesterday, kind of Sedgwickian intuitions about super general principle like the utilitarian principle. So this is something that operates somewhere in a lower level, and of course, even you accept that this mid-type of intuition has some moral force, but of course somebody could also question the reliability here and raise a question about what processes generate those kind of intuitions. That's a side point, really. I suppose, and my jet lag is starting to snatch at me. But your main point was about the relevance of processes. Again, I think, as I try to argue, and I think what you actually said in reply is consistent with that, although I'm not sure you would agree, is that the fact that some process is emotional or not in itself doesn't tell us anything, especially if it's a proximal process that just tells you what happens when you generate the intuition at the time. I think that just doesn't tell you anything about the reliability of what's being produced. You need to tie that immediate thing to something broader. You mentioned evolutionary history, and as I said, once you tie that, the fact that something is an automatic process maybe is very, very weak evidence that it has an evolutionary basis. I mean, tiny, tiny evidence. But once you support the claim that it has an evolutionary basis, I don't think this needs to play any kind of role in the argument. And as I try to point out, once you bring in evolution, you risk getting a general kind of skepticism, which is not going to support any kind of particular normative conclusion one way or the other. The other point, I mean, I think you move between two kinds of claims. One that I not only accept, I actually practice. People like me who also work in my scenes in applied ethics, we argue against silly gut reactions and intuitions all the time, and I probably have 5 or 10 papers just unraveling silly gut reaction people have to vast new technologies, etc., etc. I don't think that this point supports any kind of grand conclusions in ethical theory. It's very important in the field when you're defending a particular thing and dealing with kind of intuition that are very far from the kind of intuition that Frances was talking about. These are kind of very crude, unthought of intuition that are actually often responding to very vague empirical claims. This will be very dangerous if you do something unnatural. Like kind of quasi-consequentialist intuition that are gut reactions that are often lead us astray, if you want. But that's very different from the kind of broad claim that our intuitions, when we do them properly, when we reflect on them properly, are not going to be tracking something outer that's genuine. Just a final point, I suppose, I might be allowed. And this relates to the picture between manual mode and point and click ways of doing things. Of course, in normative and applied ethics, we never do point and click responses to particular ethical issues. We take intuition as an input to a quite complicated process. The idea that we either need to follow a gut reaction or reason from some principle that God knows where it comes from, because it also will need to come from a point and click kind of intuition. These are not the only two options. Actual ethical theorizing involves reflecting on intuition, rejecting quite a few of them as based on gut reaction or irrelevant factors, etc., etc. But quite a few survive the process unless you start out with a skeptical assumption that there's nothing out there that we are being responding to. I think I probably have a few other things to say, but I don't think I'll be allowed to. Anyway, thanks.
Yes, let's thank our speaker. My gut reaction and considered opinion that it's time for the next talk. So thanks to Kahane.